G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'm going to have a bit of a rant about the Sydney Seaplane that crashed into the Hawkesbury River at Pilgrim Creek near Cowhan on New Year's Eve. Now, part one, line one, yeah, I'm sorry for the people who were in the aeroplane, who died in the aeroplane. There was a 44-year-old Canadian pilot with 9,000 hours in his logbook. There was a British billionaire CEO with his two sons. There was the billionaire's fiance and the fiance's daughter, and they'd had a meal at a restaurant at Cowhan, and they were flying back to Sydney to watch the New Year's Eve firework display. News reports have it that shortly after takeoff, the seaplane crashed. No survivors. A day or two later, it emerged that it was a de Havilland Canada DH-2 Beaver which crashed. For those of you unfamiliar, this is a DHC-2 Beaver belonging to Aerial Agriculture, which used to be based at Armidale. This is in about 1990, painted up in the old livery, dropping lime for a display at a air show at Glen Innes. Here is an Air Agriculture Beaver in 1993 in what I think of as the new livery. But as you can see, it's a high wing radial engine monoplane, strut braced wing, fixed undercarriage. These ones at Air Ag, you can see there's an air intake on the top of the rear of the right hand side of the engine cowling. That's because they had a 650 horsepower engine, as opposed to the original 450 horsepower engine, which has its air intake under the cowling, and this one is on floats with an RAAF Rondell, a 7-seat communications utility aircraft, served from 1955 to 64. The RAAF had 5 of them, loaded weight 5,100 pounds. You can probably bump that up to about 6,000 pounds with the bigger engine. The Air Force used the 450 horsepower and 95 knots maximum speed. Put floats on them, probably bring the speed down a little bit. Add the bigger engine, brings the speed back up. So on floats with the big engine, they could probably do 95 knots, which is about 107 miles per hour. Now, the reason I sidetracked into the Beavers of Aerial Agriculture at Armidale is because news emerged, filtered out, was released to the public, put it how you will, during the week, that the Sydney Seaplanes Beaver, which crashed at Hawkesbury, had previously crashed at Armidale and killed its pilot, and it had been rebuilt. And I thought, well, it's difficult to imagine fatally crashing a Beaver and having enough left of the Beaver that it would be economically viable to rebuild. However, I talked to a few people, and somebody with more knowledge explained to me that, no, it wasn't rebuilt from one crashed Beaver, it was rebuilt from 2 crashed Beavers, both of which had been written off by the insurance, both of which had been operated by Aerial Agriculture, both of them had been crashed. Somebody bought the wrecks, built one complete aeroplane out of the 2 wrecks, had it all inspected, certified, sold it to somebody. That somebody flew it for a few years, had no problems. They sold it to somebody, flew it for years, they had no problems. They sold it to Sydney Seaplanes, and their Canadian pilot had a bad day on New Year's Eve. Because I'm an aeroplane freak, not only do I have photos of VHRAY, Romeo Alpha Yankee, I got to ride in it twice on crop dusting flights, operating from an ag strip at Red Range. That big rounded looking thing in the bottom left hand corner of this picture is the air intake for the 630 horsepower engine. So I've got a bit of a soft spot for Beavers. In fact, my son's first 3 flights were in an Aerial Agriculture Beaver. And this particular shot of the village of Red Range, I was trying to get my own house, which is about there, just slightly out of frame. I clicked off too soon. But as you might expect, my son decided that the pilot of the Beaver who took him for a fly was a bit of a hero, and any time he saw him around the town, he'd say good day to him. When Craig Gunter had an occasion to force land or crash land an aerial agriculture Beaver, VHXIX, X-ray India X-ray, he gave my son some photos of the crash, which occurred early on a cold, dewy morning at Guyra, when he was carrying a ton of copper sulphate, which was apparently necessary for better pastures in that part of the country. Anyway, the supercharger on the engine failed, and when that happened, his 630 horsepower engine suddenly became about a 300 horsepower engine, and with a ton of copper sulphate in the hopper, that wasn't enough power to maintain altitude, so he tried to dump the hopper, but owing to the temperature and the dew and the moisture and whatnot, the crystals wouldn't flow. Therefore he couldn't dump the hopper, thus and because he was forced to mush onto the hillside, hitting hard enough that he broke the undercarriage, hitting hard enough that the weight of the engine bent the engine bearers, completely totaled the left-hand undercarriage, and broke the front and rear wing spar outboard of the strut attachment points, bent the propeller blades backwards, which indicates that there was no power on at the moment of impact. I'm getting my vertical from the star pickets and the tree trunks rather than the frame of the picture. So, having broken the undercarriage, the wing spar on one side and the engine mounts, and written off the propeller and damaged the engine, the pilot, Craig Gunter, got out and walked away, because the Beaver is a very strong, robust, sturdy utility aircraft, and it's quite survivable in a crash if you've got control of the aeroplane and you can plonk it on the ground right side up. Even if you thump it on hard enough to break bits of the aeroplane, the occupants are generally okay, even if the insurance company considers it a write-off. So this is the de Havilland Canada DHC-2 Beaver, which crashed at Guyra in the 1990s and did not kill the pilot, which, together with the other wreck that did kill its pilot, were purchased by somebody who rebuilt them into one aeroplane, which finished up looking like this. As you can see, the tail is intact, the fuselage is intact, the cabin is intact. The wings have been ripped off, the floats have been ripped off. The engine mounting has been deformed, and we'll see in a minute, the propeller has been bent back, like the three blades of the propeller. There we go. All three blades bent back. Engine cowling ripped off. There we have a slightly less reflection plagued view of it. And because this is being winched upside down out of the river, look at it like that. See how the engine has been bent downwards and to the right, and see how the blades are definitely folded back. The fact that they're folded back means the engine was stopped, it wasn't producing power. If the engine had been producing power, those blades would be bent forward, because there's no slippage when a blade goes through water, not the way it does when it goes through air. So I figured this thing was slightly past fully inverted when it hit the water. It wasn't going particularly fast, maybe only 60 to 90 miles per hour, but it was going straight down. And when the news emerged that the crashed seaplane had been rebuilt as a composite from the wreckage of two others, People were suggesting that, oh, who'd want to go flying in an aeroplane that's been crashed previously? You know, like surely something to do with the crash must have caused this crash. Previous crash got to cause the current one. However, that's not necessarily so. I reckon that the level of inspections that goes on before you can re-register an aeroplane after it's been written off, it's so stringent that the previous crash had nothing to do with the current crash. The current crash seems to have come about because the engine has stopped. Shortly after takeoff, the engine stopped, which means the aeroplane has had to become a glider. Now, when you're looking at gliding, one point comes to mind almost immediately is that a beaver on floats has a lot more drag and a lot more weight than a beaver on wheels. Now, the extra weight, together with the extra weight of the bigger engine, means the wings have to lift a bit more. That means you have to have a bit more speed in order to remain flying. And at that extra speed, those floats are going to make a fair bit of drag, together with the struts that hold the floats on. So when the engine fails, a beaver on floats will slow down a lot faster than a beaver on wheels. And as we know from our 1940 vintage textbook, in stable level flight, lift must equal weight and thrust must equal drag. And if you lose your thrust, in order to maintain the speed necessary to generate the lift in order to carry the weight against the drag, what you have to do is to become a glider. And aeroplanes with a lot of drag don't glide as well as aeroplanes with only a little bit of drag. The measurement of the angle of glide will give a simple estimate of the efficiency of the aeroplane. And a floatified beaver, because it has more weight and more drag than a wheelified beaver, will not glide as well. You'll have to stick the nose further down and glide at a higher speed to overcome the extra drag, all while trying to find somewhere to put the beaver down. On the Hawkesbury River, close to sundown on New Year's Eve, when there's going to be lots of pleasure craft out there, lots of parties on moored yachts. So you've got a narrow waterway, a twisting waterway with lots of boats. So my guess is that the pilot of the Sydney Seaplane Beaver took off, lost engine power, either failed to stuff the nose down sufficiently far in order to maintain airspeed, or possibly there's an and in here, tried to turn in order to get a better alignment. And just as we established that the only way to maintain airspeed while gliding is to dive, you find that when you are turning you have to bank, and when you are banking the stall speed of the wing increases. I'm sure you remember that a wing will generate lift owing to a pressure differential, which only occurs when the airflow is smooth going over the wing. And if you fly too slow, the airflow breaks away from the wing and the aerofoil is said to have stalled, and in that condition it creates lots and lots of drag but not much lift, a phenomenon which can be graphed. So when turning, when banking, an aeroplane's stall speed increases. So your beaver on floats, which may have stalled at 45 knots in straight and level flight, will stall at 90 knots at 60 degrees of bank and 450 knots at 84.5 degrees of bank. In practice, that won't happen. What will occur is you will lose height in a steep gliding turn. And if you're low down and you try to stretch the glide, you won't have enough speed, you'll stall, and you'll probably drop one wing and spin in. If you try to turn, attempting to line up on a better place to put it down, if you turn without lowering the nose to increase the speed to compensate for the angle of bank, you'll stall a wing and you'll spin in. And that's pretty much what seems to have occurred here. 45 degrees of bank would give you about a 67 knot stall, and he was probably gliding at 65 to 70 knots, and the left wing stalled, and it flicked over and went into a spin, and it was upside down in a vertical dive when it hit the water. Pulled the wings off, wrecked everything. So there you go, and now you know. And that's the story of the Beaver which has now crashed 3 times, counting the crashes of the two it was made from and the crash of the resulting composite. And dare one say that if it was not a Beaver on floats, if the engine had failed on a wheeled Beaver taking off from an airstrip on land, either the crash would not have occurred or the forced landing would have been survivable because it wouldn't have been stalled from the float drag. Warbles not a lot to YouTube. Ciao.